I have the privilege of introducing our last speaker, not only of today, but of the entire Institute, Terry Nichols Clark. Terry Nichols Clark is professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago and the international coordinator of the Fiscal, Austerity, and Urban Innovation Project, which is surveying city officials across the U.S. and in 35 other countries. His research interests include urban sociology, transnational processes, and the use of decision-making theory to approach urban politics and social phenomena. He holds MA and PhD degrees from Columbia University and has taught at Columbia, Harvard, Yale, the Sorbonne, and UCLA, and has worked at the Brookings Institution, the Urban Institute, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. He has consulted with many local governments and civic and financial institutions over the past 35 years. A prolific scholar, and his publications are too numerous to mention, but Professor Clark has written or contributed to over 400 journal articles, reports, and book chapters. He has edited several volumes, including The City as Entertainment Machine, Urban Innovation, and Urban Policy Analysis, Directions for Future Research. And he has co-authored numerous books, including Financial Handbook for Mayors and City Managers, and City Money, Political Processes, Fiscal Strain, and Retrenchment. Please join me in welcoming Professor Clark.
Thank you. Grand introduction. It's good to be here. Migration is a fascinating topic and sort of a litmus test of how much the world is changing with globalization in particular, particularly marked since 1989. Things are just changing very rapidly all around the world. The models, in terms of the topic of this conference, of what drives migration and why, is more complicated in the sense that we have more models, I'm suggesting, more dynamics. I heard a few in the last minutes about how things work in the Middle East in ways that don't seem to fit what one might imagine. At the same time, what we tend to have is not the old models totally disappearing. They're still there in some locations, maybe in rural areas or some neighborhoods. Or I sometimes say in the city of Chicago, you can find almost all these things. If you look, there are all kinds of things going on. And so what does this mean for us trying to get an overview that's not too much, if you will, anti-generalizing of saying each person is a rule unto his or herself, or each city or each migration decision is different. There are some generalities, and what I'm going to try to do is fill in some of the spaces in between to try to get a sense of what's changing and why. One quick distinction is between descriptive and analytical, and that's found in a number of the readings and that you've been looking at, as well as in the press and so forth. As descriptive, we'll often say, in the U.S., the migration rate is X, while in France it's that. Or in Chicago it's this, and people are moving less to Chicago or away from Chicago than they did before. The problem with this is twofold. One, anything that has a city name or a nation name is not really an analysis. It's more descriptive. The question is why? Why is Chicago or the U.S. or Dubai changing? And that is more complicated. It tends to, if for instance, is it because of age? Is it because of new regulations? Is it because of the welfare benefits? And how to put those together so that we can begin to interpret what Dubai means or what Chicago means in the case of a particular example like that. So we need often better data, and we often need lower level data. For example, in Chicago, we have some neighborhoods, blue-collar industrial neighborhoods, have been declining since the 1950s in general. Around the steel works in the South Side, there's massive depopulation and so forth. At the same time, there's a doubling in the population size of young professionals on the near North Side within the last 10 years, even though the city is... So my point is the city or the metro area as a whole may be doing one thing, but the causal dynamics are very different in many different locations. And the total descriptive number, or what is the growth or the decline rate of the whole metro area or the whole city of Chicago, is an aggregation of many complex processes. So what I'm going to try to do is fill in some of the specifics with a few examples in ways that we can document and systematize this with work we have in progress. I suggested some readings which are posted, and I'll just briefly mention sort of some key points from them for those of you who don't remember every line. I put up something called City Money, it's a chapter from a book called City Money that I did with several talented students here, maybe was in 1983, I think it was published. At that time, most of the models of migration tended to be that people moved to jobs. Jobs are the big drivers. Or if they're not just jobs, they're sort of private sector characteristics of individuals. Government, amenities, more complicated things were largely not included in a central manner in most migration work. City Money, in the selection that I put out for you, did two things that were moving in this newer direction. One, it talked about government policies and how they could make a difference, and especially we had data on welfare benefits and tax burdens, and showed that people tended to move away. Middle-class people, people above the poverty line, moved away from higher tax burden areas. Some of the poorer people tended at least there was a net migration, such that there were fewer people moving away from areas with higher welfare benefits, fewer disadvantaged persons. So we showed, and this is after you control for 15 or so other standard variables: income, education, race, population size, and the like. So then in the conclusion, I stress the degree to which many of the rules from the past are changing in post-industrial society. Chicago is a perfect example. When we have industrial neighborhoods in Chicago. We have, however, lots of others that are not, and the rules are often very different in those too. And as we move toward post-industrial society, we tend to have fewer unions, fewer big factories. We tend to have smaller jobs. They tend to be more professionalized. They tend to value more creativity and individualism. And these are in conflict with the traditional industrial sorts of jobs and dynamics. And I suggested that the new smaller economy or smaller firms tends to more reflect preferences of individuals. Why is that critical for migration? In the old model, you would move to the factory. You'd leave Mississippi, you'd leave rural Iowa, you'd move to Detroit or Chicago in order to work in the big factory, the old model. The newer model is, I sometimes summarize as Sally. Sally's a second-year student at the University of Chicago, and she got bored. So she spent a summer in San Diego, and then when the fall came around, Mom said, "Sally, it's time to go back to the USC." And she said, "Mom, I'm going to stay in San Diego." Mom said, "Oh, really?" So she said, Mom said, "Well, I don't think you should do that, Sally." And Sally said, "Yes, I'd really like to, Mom." And Mom said, "Well, I'm not going to send you any more checks. If you're going to stay there, you've got to make your own way." So Sally then opens a veggie burger stand on the beach. This illustrates Sally's preferences drive the economy of San Diego. The preferences came first. The migration then followed. And then the economy of San Diego was enhanced by Sally's veggie burger stand. She did not get invited to San Diego to work in a veggie burger shop. She chose San Diego first. My point is that's a new model where the individual is the driver, and we're having a dramatic heightening of citizen empowerment, of individualization, so we've got both of these going on, and we've got measures of each. And so the chapter then pointed out, even in the data which were available then, in the 1970s and 80s, we had evidence of both of those going on, but we didn't have a very clear way of identifying how and why, especially Sally's move was working. Okay, we've been clarifying Sally for 20 years now, and we've got better ways of trying to interpret Sally and John and others who move for non-standard, non-job reasons. And that's what I mainly want to focus on. But filling in some of the others who've moved in this direction, there's a paper by Ed Glazer in the City as an Entertainment Machine book, which I edited, And Glaser is probably the top urban economist in the world today. He's a professor at Harvard, has a degree from here, and he has a paper called Consumer City. That is, he's done dozens of papers, many, if not most of which, and even his new book, and he basically stresses more the job dynamic model in the book. Nevertheless, in this paper, Consumer City, he quasi-reverses it. He shows how the consumer may be attracted by cinemas or by other things in a city, and one can look at such things as so-called reverse migration. If you go at rush hour to a big city freeway and see how many lanes, how many cars are going out to the suburbs and how many are coming back in. And if they're more, if people are going to the suburbs to work, that's one model. If instead they're coming back, if you have people coming from the suburbs at 7 p.m. or 6 p.m. as they do from the suburbs, they're coming to downtown for consumption, for going to Navy Pier, restaurants, opera, all kinds of consumption activities. Okay, and models of each of those are needed. Okay, so Glaser I'm just mentioning as an example of economists who began to work on amenities about 25 years ago. That is, the job model people talk of as an economic model, but smart economists would say that people don't maximize their income, they maximize their utility. And the utility is defined as utility equals income plus amenities. And amenities are what I'm really going to focus on. Amenities are those things you don't pay for through a market. You don't buy a meal, you don't buy a car, but you get it because you are in an area where there's clean air, there's a nice view, there's a beach. Those are things or public education, low crime rates. You don't pay for those through a market, but they have a huge, important impact. I ask my students in most every class, how many of you would take a job in a town of 2,000 in South Dakota that paid you $100,000, or would you take the same job that paid you half, $50,000 in New York, Chicago, and LA? And what do you think they say? Okay, 90% every year, every class say Chicago, New York, and LA. They will take half of the salary and go to the bigger city. What does that say? Those amenities are worth $50,000 for each of those students. This is big money. Mayor Daley understands this. He has been building amenities with a vengeance since about 1995. He didn't get elected on this program. He came up through his traditions of his father and the like. But in 1990, okay, I'm doing an oral history of Chicago. I won't go into that. I can if you want, but the city, and the other reason this is important is that there's a book by Rich Longworth called Caught in the Middle. It's the first book on cities and towns and villages in the Midwest and how they're different from the rest of the country. And basically, the main story he tells is that people in small town Midwestern areas, or as well as Milwaukee, Detroit, St. Louis, will say the Chinese and the Mexicans and the people in Dubai are stealing our jobs, and we are left with empty cornfields and factories that are defunct. We are victims. And then he says in a new chapter, except in Chicago. Okay, and what's different about Chicago? Amenities. And that's the answer that my students give. I want to be here because we got all these amenities. I don't want to go to, declining St. Louis or Detroit or even Minneapolis. Okay. So in that sense, what I'm briefly mentioning is changes in models, such as the students don't take the money. Sally takes starts a veggie burger stand in San Diego. And I'm illustrating some of I'm making the quick point that economists had a sense of this 25 years ago. And they started to try to measure amenities. That is, you can't measure them with what people pay, so they began to develop ways of trying to do this by measuring such things as cities that were higher in land value or home value if they had cleaner air, things of that sort. Rich Florida's two pieces stress, first, I got confused. The argument of Glaser, the main argument of Glaser is that that talent drives the economy, and talent is critical to be attracted. And Rich Florida agrees with it. So Florida, Glaser, and I have been sort of making the general argument that one ought to pay attention to these amenities and consumption. And they're critical in transforming the world. And we've been getting lots of flack. We get criticized for all kinds of stuff. Florida, in the piece I suggest you take a look at, stresses now there are two. One is the flight of the creative class. The other is the spiky paper. All right, the spiky paper basically is a critique of the world is flat argument, that now we have computers, we have the internet, anybody can live anywhere, it doesn't make any difference. And he shows with three little graphics that if you look at the economy, if you look at patents, and if you look at citations to scientific papers, they're increasingly very spiky and very concentrated. That is, there's a small number of elite places like this campus right here, where there are lots of people who are writing papers that are people citing, people see, and if you map this for the entire world, there are a small number of spiky places. So even though you could do Nobel Prize work in chemistry in the middle of the desert, it helps if you got a whole lot of smart postdocs who are working with you 24 hours a day, and you're all sort of helping each other with experiments, talking about stuff, and so there's a local dynamism which can transform these patterns. That's point one. Point two, there's a lot, the talent, the way it works now, or it has worked in the last few decades, involves a whole lot of migration by some very talented people. And these people, in turn, can transform the whole economy of China or India or Japan and the US. People talk about the brain drain. People talk about talented students from lesser developed countries who come to the West. And some go back, some don't, or they go back in various ways. For instance, one major example is poor young engineers in India get educated. They may get some degrees in India, or they may get a final degree or not in the US. Then they go to Silicon Valley. They make a couple of $1 billion over 10 or 15 years. And then they may open some factory. They may have a few more patents. They may be part of something going on in Silicon Valley. And then they say, either because for whatever reason they can do it cheaper, or they have friends, or they have Indian patriotism, they then transform a lot of this activity to India. And so their locations, Bangalore in India, are booming with computer programming in ways that are linked with these global patterns. The point I'm making is the interpenetration. Okay, so in Florida's point in the Rise to Creative Class book basically is, with the Bush administration's clampdown after 9/11 on international migration, this is a major problem for the talented migration, for high-level conferences, for grad students, and for others, in ways that can potentially severely dampen the most creative parts of research, design, and the economy. Okay. Okay, let me shift to some of what we have here. The other reading was on scenes, but that's what I mainly want to try to develop for you here. This is just, we'll start briefly with an example of testing the creative class idea of Florida to link with some of that discussion. This now, so I mentioned very briefly, and I'll illustrate it more here. To model these new patterns, ideally, we want to go drill down to as low a level as we can. Not just the whole US, not just states, not just cities, zip codes. So we've now got zip codes and street addresses for millions of data points. This permits us to find more fine-grained dynamics going on and to separate them instead of having them sort of mushed all together. Okay, so what attracts a creative class? Here we have data for every U.S. zip code, about 42,000, and we've got a bunch of indicators. And this is not all of this will be crystal clear, but it should be in about 20 minutes. Okay, so what this basically says is, what are the factors that attract or drive away or discourage the creative class? Creative class defined as more or less, I think in this case it's college graduates. Okay, so where do college graduates move, and what are the positive and negative factors? Got to get here myself. We've got the standard variables: per capita income, proportion of non-white, Christian churches, population size, and this has a positive impact or a negative impact, net of everything else in the regression model. This is renting, rent. So places with people move especially to low rent zip codes. You may have a low rent zip code in Brooklyn outside Manhattan, or a low rent zip code in Chicago, even though you're within shooting distance on Saturday night or Tuesday night of other places. Yes? Okay, so yeah, sorry, I gotta stay near here. That's fine. Yeah, okay, very good. It's just that sometimes I can't read it myself. So the two variables that are most important here are low rent and voting Democratic. We also have over on the left I'll just mention briefly, and this is what I want to introduce, some things that you don't see in the normal past literature. Traditional scenes. Okay, utilitarian, egalitarian, and neighborly scenes. These are what I want to introduce and talk about. These are neighborhood characteristics that we'll look at in a new way. Here's another quick example, just to link the whole scenes idea with migration more directly. One point we make is we also want not just to talk about total migration, we want to break up types of migration by geographic area and by type of person. So not total, but also by age cohort, by young people, that is, with as much detail as we can get from the available sources. The main source is the U.S. or the national census in each country. And they have data by age cohort. They have college graduates, percent non-white. And the main point of this is to show that if we have a regression where we control a bunch of all those things over on the left, the results differ for different age cohorts. So for instance, Rich Florida was here a few years ago, and he gave a talk for an hour, and he talked about what you need to really be a dynamic, creative city and have things really go well. The first question was, how can Chicago do this with the weather we have? How can we ever keep up with Silicon Valley and San Diego? Okay, and his answer was, Terry Clark and I have a book, and in the chapter I've analyzed basically the elderly move to warm spots, mountains, streams, and natural amenities. For people 25 to 34, those have almost no impact. And in terms of the creative economy, at least I would say there's too much focus on the young, but at least there's a lot of focus on 25 to 34-year-old recent college graduates. And the short point is they're coming to Chicago, even though it's cold. So the point of this is different classes of people, different sectors of society move for different reasons, with just that one quick example as an illustration. Okay, I'll briefly just show this. This summarizes 8 books in one picture. And it basically is that the old model, I'll try this pointer here. The old models of class politics and clientelism, which are sort of politics is rich versus poor, or patronage is clientelism, nepotism, as they have in Naples and elsewhere in Chicago and so forth. These are changing dramatically. They're changing in good part because of a lesser national government emphasis, and globalization. Globalization is changing a whole lot of things. and which you've heard more commonly discussed, migration, the end of the Cold War, I mean, economic factors. What we add here is there's a whole lot of politics that's also changing. That the traditional clientelism, class politics and the like, such as the socialist, potential socialist future president of France, had trouble in a New York hotel, and France may have a different president as a consequence. That's a social issue. He was not saying your price is too high. It was not a fiscal, the point is moral, ethical, lifestyle, consumption issues are a major part of politics and lifestyle today. Why? And how does that relate to this? Because we have more egalitarianism, because citizens are more important, more legitimate as a source of legitimacy, and average folks can understand basic personal values and morality, and those become more important, whereas I'm not saying that traditional jobs and economic incentives are no longer, they're still there, but they've got these new things to compete with. Issue politics, the environment, lifestyle, citizen participation, market individualism, roles of women, questioning the welfare state and trying to find more efficient ways of delivering those same great services, etc. We've got a lot of shakeups in the political systems around the world, and even if a country like Argentina or Iraq try not to be part of the rest of the world, there's enough pressure to make it much harder. I mean, the world has drastically changed in this respect in the last 15 years. This in turn tends to lead to consumption, public goods, and amenities, and the development of a new flexible economy. Okay, so this is the big picture. I won't try to. Elements of that are simply informing what we're dealing with here, and so I won't talk about it so much as to draw one conclusion, is to say people are not just moving for money. Think of the students at the USC. 1, 2. Consumption and lifestyle are increasingly important, but how can we capture it specifically? It's not yet captured here, but what we're going to do is especially include this. This is a simple way of saying we have 3 models. Up at the top, it's hard to read it there, but that says Model 1. Okay, Model 1, Model 2, Model 3. This is the 19th century model, Alfred Marshall, and so forth. The classic factors of production, land, labor, capital, and management, lead to jobs. People then move to jobs. This is the classic model. So people leave the cotton of Mississippi and they come to Chicago and Detroit. Classic old style model. Okay, Gary Becker in particular started talking about human capital. Human capital, economists mainly measure as education. People who have more education can lead to more economic growth, and that in turn will attract more people. Fine. We accept Model 1. We accept Model 2. What we add is Model 3 and say, especially if you go to the urban or neighborhood level, amenities make a difference too. And amenities especially can attract highly educated, talented people. So the talented people, as I mentioned, my USC students say they don't want to go to a small town in South Dakota. They want to go to a more urbane locale. That in turn leads, that's this causal path here, leading to the human capital going and creating more jobs, which in turn lead to the veggie burger stand. Okay, so the veggie burger stand can be a new driver of the economy, where the amenities, the San Diego beach, is what attracted Sally, not the Detroit job. Okay, so my point is, all 3 of these are still going on. There are people in Chicago and people in Bangladesh who still primarily are driven by a job and by the incentives. But the more talented, simple suggestion, the more we have talented people and jobs growing, which is not always true, there's competition for those people, and that is, those talented people can then say, okay, I've got 5 job offers. 1 is in San Diego, 1 is in small town South Dakota, and 1's in Chicago. So it's not as if you ignore the job, but you combine the job decision with the lifestyle decision. So it's a simultaneous decision. Okay, let me add one more point here briefly, which is, along with consumption being more important, so are the arts. The arts, culture, music, and related activities. And Robert Putnam has a famous book called Bowling Alone, where he documents the story that looks sort of the opposite. His basic line goes like that, which is to say there are fewer people from the 1950s and 60s on up to present who are joining Lions clubs, the Boy Scouts, churches. And he argues it's a crisis of democracy because these civic associations are in decline. He's right if you look at all organizations that are surveyed by the main surveys. But if you break out the types, which he never does in the book, he has a few individual examples, but he break it out into subtypes carefully and say, how much is this true of manufacturing, of services, of this or that, or of church organizations, or of various kinds? It's true of most of those types, but the opposite holds for these. And we were amazed when we found this about 3 or 4 years ago. This is to say, in the U.S., we have had an increase of people. This is a national sample of 1,500 Americans who were asked in these 3 years, how many of the following are you a member of? And they could mention Boy Scouts, this and that, and then also education, mutual, or cultural activities. And in 1961, or is that 81? 81, yeah. 1981, 12% of Americans said I'm a member of an arts and culture activity. In 1999, 36% said I'm a member. In the Netherlands, so the U.S. Tripled, and in the Netherlands it was even higher. If we go on to other countries, social welfare participation rose in the Netherlands. I want to go rapidly, but union participation, no change basically in the U.S. Okay, multiple countries. The point is, this is not just the U.S. and the Netherlands. We have this in the Scandinavian countries, many other countries around the world, but not all countries. It's flat in much of Western Europe, and it's negative in the former communist countries for reasons related, we sense, to the organizations that were salient before 1989, and then new ones which have not really engaged the population as actively as they probably will in the next few years. Okay. These arts and culture organizations are especially important for young people. So people 15 to 24 say something, what is this? 17% of them are members of these organizations, whereas people who are over 65, it's less than 1%. So the young are involved in rock bands, in stand-up entertainment, in organizations that are often small, volatile. They often create them themselves, and they're missed in the so-called benchmark surveys of the National Endowment for the Arts, which documents traditional symphonies, opera, museums, which are sort of slowly declining. That's the Putnam story. But if you include summer dance, you include electronic music, all kinds of these new arts and culture activities, youth are very, very involved. Okay. All right, brief example of what we're doing internationally. We have parallel studies coming along in France, Spain, Korea, Japan, and China. France, the long-standing organizations are these. But if we look at those that are increasing in the last 10 years, culture is number one. So they're increasing the number of cultural organizations in France using that measure. Why? And how does this relate to migration? Traditionally, or even today, young people, roughly 18 to 20 to 24, move to Paris. They go there for studying, they go there for a first job, they go there when they're not married, when they don't have any expenses, and they live in a garret, they live in a basement, they camp out. I mean, they live very inexpensively because it's very expensive to live in Paris. They then get married in their 30s, and They move down here or here. They leave Paris. So if you look at net migration for all areas of France, all of this northern region of France of traditional manufacturing is losing population. The population is increasing around Marseille and over here on the Atlantic coast and down by Spain. So dramatic differences north to south. Look at England, the Midlands, all the traditional industrial area, major decline. Look at Detroit in the US, Ohio, the Midwest. Same kind of story. That is, we're seeing massive migration patterns, and there's a push, if you will, away from traditional manufacturing. But the other question is, why is there a pull? And I gave you San Diego and the veggie burger example, but what's happening? Maybe they have things like veggie burgers here. Okay, that's my point. But rather than saying it's just the veggie burger, we want to have a more subtle analysis. So we'll come to that. All right, I'm going to skip this for reasons of time, just to show. But what we do is we bring in. We went to France in part because the French have so much cultural activity supported traditionally by the Ministry of Culture and others. There we go. Okay, and it has an impact, but it's not the traditional Louvre, the national culture. The top-down people are moving away from the top-down culture. They're moving toward the grassroots culture when we control other kinds of things. Okay. All right. The main thing I want to get to now is the idea of scenes. Scenes was in the last reading, which I suggested you take a look at, and this is our background, which I'll introduce. A scene is a neighborhood, like Hyde Park, with physical structures like the USC, with people, with combinations of these activities, and activities like coming to a conference on migration, but we also then specifically stress the values informing those activities. And the types of values are critical, in such as Sally wanting the lifestyle of the beach, or the young USC students who do not want the lifestyle of the town of 2000 in North Dakota. And that's what we want to elaborate. The quick point of these is that this is happening from Naples to Chicago. Lifestyle. Bogota. Dramatic transformation, recapturing of public space. These were three cities, Naples, Chicago, and Bogota, were all known for mafia, crime, dirtiness, nastiness, people, nobody wanting to move there in their right minds. And they all, in the last 20 years, have dramatically changed themselves through consumption, aesthetics, lifestyle, such as I'm mentioning how Chicago is the big exception in the Midwest. These two other cities in Italy and Latin America illustrate very similar patterns, and all three are driven by very smart, dynamic mayors who transform the traditional rules of the game. Okay, scenes as systems of social consumption. We have three concepts here, which the scene is the one we're introducing, which we contrast with the residential neighborhood and the industrial district. And the new experiences are amenities and the values informing them, which you as a consumer can experience in a scene. Okay, that's a quick overview, and we'll fill in more. And most of my examples today are mainly from the U.S., although, as I say, we've got 200-page reports now on Seoul and Paris we just finished in the last few weeks. We merge a variety of data. So one of the more original are these electronic yellow pages. We downloaded millions of listings of every Starbucks in the U.S., every Baptist church, every Mormon church. And so we've got all kinds of amenities, and we put them all together, and then we look at their relative impacts on where people move and why, as well as a citizen survey of 84,000 citizens where we have data by country, by county. Putnam used these, but these are it's a new survey where we have items like, how often in the last year have you gone to a concert, gone to church, gone out to dinner, and these are broken up by age, lifestyle, number, what sort of family arrangements do you have, and so forth. So we built a massive new database, which more extensive than anybody ever had before on things like this. And then we can see here, as I'm mentioning, the number one ranked in the biggest three cities is pizza restaurants. Number two, Baptist churches. Number three, bookstores. So we've got, this is our raw data. These are the amenities. Economists have taken often one or two or three of these and put them in a model and said, cinemas make a difference, or pizza restaurants restaurants may make a difference. What we do with the scene idea is to say, we don't want just one or two, we want all of them. We want to look at all these things and how the whole configuration of a neighborhood is defined as a scene, and the scene is the aggregation of all of these things together, and how then people react to the pizza restaurant combined with a Baptist church or not, etc. Okay, so we then classify the values, which I flagged there, in terms of three general types: theatricality, authenticity, and legitimacy, which are pretty general, but these are more specific. These 15 we focus on a lot. So these are under those three general headings. We have specifics like traditionalism, self-expression, charisma, egalitarianism, glamour, localism, ethnic pride, and so forth. And these, we're suggesting, are major drivers which differentiate, which can attract Sally to San Diego and lead Sally to say, I'm not going to go to a small town in South Dakota or Texas. Okay, and we'll elaborate. How do we use those 15 and how do they make a difference? I'm going to focus on one that may seem the most outrageous and not appropriate, especially if we're talking about lower status persons. But I'll add, I've always lived at the U.S. I've never lived in Hyde Park or the Loop. I've always lived in Bronzeville, which is an African-American, classically low-income neighborhood halfway between here and the Loop. And yet, my neighbors, 98% African-American, have a sense of glamour, which comes, I won't try to go through too much history and background, except to say this is not just a yuppie theory. We want to push on and see how, what's glamour? We measure it with such things as these items get positive scores, these items get negative scores. We have all 15, but we don't have time to go through all 15, so I'm going to focus on glamour just to show you some of these other things that are there. And then quickly, this is an idea of why are these scenes more important for some people or some societies. These are too small and detailed for you to read. This is a summary of it, which is to say, as primordial attachments decline, you heard the Dubai kind of example, as race, class, gender, and national origin recede in their explanatory power in people's lives and in the ways that we can measure it with studies, then other things begin to enter, such as participation in scenes. And as there are less tight social attachments, we have more confidence and trust with people in general. We have more time. That is, some people have more, some have less time. But if that is people who are unmarried, who are unemployed, who don't have a job, and so forth, have more time, those in turn lead them to go out, hang around in Streeterville in Chicago these days, and so forth. They go to, this week with Taste of Chicago going on, you have a sense of all of this, of how dramatic this is for the city. Aesthetic sensitivity, sociability. People who are really who don't want to be sociable can still stay at home, but those who are more sociable are likely to go out. Information, etc. So these are the factors which in general tend to lead to more scenes, and this is too hard to read, but it basically shows moderate support for most of those propositions. But let me briefly introduce how we measure these scenes. We create a 5-point scale from high to low for each of those amenities, like Baptist churches or pizza restaurants. So we have here, instead, I don't have pizza restaurants, I have gospel singing groups, poetry slam venues. And on each of the 15 dimensions, they get a score from 1 to 5. We then add these up for each, we add these up, and then we count the number of things like Baptist churches in each zip code, and we multiply it times that score. That then gives us a measure on glamour, transgression, exhibitionism for every zip code in the U.S. And so these are our zip code level data for each of those dimensions. Then we can look at how do these vary by region, by big regions, but I'll focus more on specific metros, and in particular, for reasons of time, I'm focusing on glamour. And glamour is highest in LA, it's medium in Chicago, and on this score it's lower in New York. Okay, if I then went to LA, and so I added a few more slides, and I calculated these for the first time for neighborhoods in LA, and found that even though this was not done for LA, we got what you'd expect. Hollywood, the Pacific Palisades, etc., are the places that score highest. Watts and the South Side areas were the lowest. Okay, this is a major finding. If you don't know about regression, let me just briefly summarize and say, what drives job growth? Why do some zip codes have more increase in the number of jobs in the whole U.S. and which ones are losing jobs? And we put in the main variables that have been analyzed by most migration studies from the past. We have education, crime, cost of living, democratic voting, population size, population, percent non-white, population in, okay. And then we add to these three measures of our scenes: glamour, tradition, and egalitarianism. What are the major findings? What drives job growth across all U.S. zip codes? Number one factor was arts jobs. Number two was education. Insignificant: crime, cost of living, and county population size. Glamour was more important than crime, than cost of living, or county population size. Wow. We were amazed at that. Okay, and so we've then gone on to specify that further, and I'm just going to skip over some of this stuff for reasons of time. We have our 15 dimensions, and then we create these other kinds of, we call these, what's our latest term is, complex scenes. Black is beautiful, Bobo's bliss, Wagner's folk, or say Disney heaven. Think of the suburban, clean, Disney-like location. We can define each of those in terms of how they rank on these more general. So the 15 I showed you are a little bit abstract, deliberately, because we want to be able, and we're using them in France, in Beijing, in Tokyo, and we then generate these in similar manner. Then we add some others for Paris and for Tokyo, which are more specific to those locations. As we do here in the example of Bohemia. So Bohemia we can define in terms of these 15 by creating an index of Bohemia based on weighting these dimensions. And so then we get the most Bohemian zip codes in Chicago based on that sort of thing. Okay, pushing on. This is too fancy. I want to show, okay. I said we need ways of capturing different kinds of models, and that scenes may either be important in their own right, as in the case of glamour, or the glamour or transgression or exhibitionism or localism may transform the operation of crime or income. That is, we're not saying race, class, gender, and national origin don't matter. We're saying they're being transformed. So what it means to be, as we heard in this discussion, what it means to be Middle Eastern is different than you may have thought in the past. Okay, so how do we capture that? I'm suggesting look at these scenes dimensions, and we can classify Dubai 10 years ago, or different subpopulations, different neighborhoods within Dubai. Okay, what this then says is, how can we then capture specifically, statistically here, the effects of a hierarchical social climate? Think of traditional Middle Eastern, or a tolerant social climate. In one of the earlier presentations I heard, you had political refugees versus people who are general immigrants. Political refugees are presumably more likely to be sensitive to a tolerant social climate. That is, if you're running away from Iran, you're probably not going to try to go to Iraq. You probably go to somewhere that's maybe a little more seen as a little more tolerant. Okay. All right. The point of so the method that I want to show you very briefly is basically twofold, and I'll just illustrate them briefly here. Okay. One is called quantile analysis. So a quintile is there are 5 groups. Quantile, you could have any number, so 5, 10, 20, or whatever. And the idea of quantile analysis is that you look at the effect of Bohemian scenes on entertainment patterns. For example, if you're in a neighborhood or a city that is more Bohemian, does it have people who file more entertainment patents? Florida suggests yes. I mean, Florida's big theory is sort of Bohemia and tolerance drive everything. We're critiquing Florida and saying, no, not just one thing. We've got 15 different types. And these we can capture in terms of, say, urbanity. Urbanity goes from very low to very high. And what this shows you, basically, is that Bohemia has a positive impact on entertainment patterns only in places that are not very urbane. These 2, or these 3. But when you get to urbane locations like New York and Chicago and LA, Bohemia doesn't have any impact, or in fact it has a negative impact. Okay, so the point is the scene. Think of urbanity as a scene dimension. The scene can shift the workings of the other variables in their relation to one another. Okay. So that's one simple example of a method. And I got lots of another example here. Do high-tech jobs increase? Does having more high-tech, think Silicon Valley, increase employment growth in general? That is, if you've got more high-tech firms, do you have more job growth? And the answer is yes, in general. But if we want to say in what kinds of scenes does this distinctly happen, the answer is the more we have a self-expressive scene, the more we have job growth. And the same thing for population growth. So that is, people who want to work in high tech are distinctly attracted to more self-expressive scenes than they are to less self-expressive scenes. That's an example of how we're not contradicting the other variables people have used. We're showing how they interact with 5 minutes. See, I'm near the end. They interact with our scenes dimensions in ways that these are illustrating our methodology for capturing. The other methodology I'll just show here is one quick example is called geographically weighted regression. If you normally do, say, if you just have a national number, like 20% of Americans are changing their residence every year, that's a national average. If you do a regression and you try to say which Americans are changing location every year, and let's look at income and age and so forth, what you get is a national average statistic for the entire U.S. That implicitly assumes, I'm wandering from this, that implicitly assumes that all Americans follow the same dynamic, that the same processes work for all Americans. What this does is say we want to recognize that there are different processes in different locations, and we want to be able to estimate, for instance, how important is racism in a city or in a zip code with a strong tradition of racism versus another where there's the opposite. And so we can find that sort of pattern for, say, change in population of non-white residents. So you do not use a national average. You can estimate the coefficient, that is the relative impact of racism and how it varies in every little zip code in the entire U.S. So, and again, what this does is get us down, it drills down to the local scene in ways that provide a methodology for implementing the kind of perspective which I'm suggesting is useful, not to refute, not to replace, but to add to the other kinds of models of migration which you have seen in this conference. I'll stop there and let's discuss. This is the classic chicken and egg problem, and the answer is it's both chicken and egg. And if we try to look at it in the case of arts jobs, we are finding that the arts jobs are more important in more recent years. If we go back 10, the classic way to try to answer it is look at data over time and what changes the patterns more over time and which comes first. And we're finding, if you go back to the 80s and early 90s, that the arts jobs have a much lower impact. So that suggests that the pattern you're describing is partly the case, that arts jobs are in part a luxury, you can say, but within the context of the U.S. society after 2000 and so forth, they are attracting. What's the positive dynamic? The positive dynamic is that they are an indicator of an amenity that is not only are they tolerant, a little bit bohemian, but they're creating more public art. They're doing things in a more aesthetically interesting way. They're sensitive to architecture, to having nicer grass, to having a variety of things. And not even if, even if you only have less than 1% of the population who are artists, having the difference between 0 and 1% is massive in terms of the potential impact. Chicago also, by the way, has the Art Institute School and Columbia College, and the combination of those and a few others mean that there are more arts graduates in Chicago than any other city in the U.S. And many of them move away, but at the beginning, a fair number of them stay on. So we've got a lot more artistic sensitivity here, as well as if you look at other places, say like Vancouver. Vancouver is massive in its concentration of artists. Vancouver's a beautiful city, in part because the artists have been sensitive. Okay. So, yes, yeah. Right. How does gentrification link with scenes? We're trying to model that now. That our general idea is that at the beginning of a gentrifying process, you may have mainly economic variables working. That is, in the very first slide I showed, talented people move to where the rent is low. So low rent may be the first critical driver for gentrification. So think of that as in the Wicker Park, there's a case study by Rich Lloyd, a book called Neo-Bohemia, and it was basically a low-income, poor neighborhood, and artists and musicians could move there in the 70s, I guess this was, 70s and 80s, and they started doing so. However, initially they just moved there as individuals. They didn't think it was not an artistic neighborhood, but then a few of them began to get together in a cafe. And that in turn led to its sort of labeling as an artistic neighborhood, and then it became the leading artist neighborhood in Chicago. Okay, 10 years after that, young stockbrokers, lawyers, and others who were a little more bohemian in lifestyle said, I'd like to live in Wicker Park, the artist neighborhood, not in Lincoln Park, which is the square neighborhood. So they moved in and they priced out the artists. So classic gentrification in this sense. Soho in New York, places in San Francisco. So the story I'm telling suggests that the amenities of Bohemia are critical not at the first stage, but at sort of a second stage. And they may have initially, the artists may have created it, but then once they had created it and it became the artistic neighborhood, that in turn attracted people whose job may not have labeled them as Bohemian, but they still had that, they had that taste. They moved there, but now it's getting less and less Bohemian. It's getting more and more gentrified, so-called, in the sense of being less Bohemian. So what I'm suggesting is that there's a combination of these traditional factors like low rent and movement and based on income and occupation, but that at an initial stage in this example, not always, gentrification may be heightened by the scene characteristic in this example of Bohemia. Or people can talk about yuppies, or it may be surfing in the case of Sally's Veggie Burger in San Diego. So so I'm suggesting not throwing out any variables, but looking at how they combine, and that I think this is a good example of how they seem to. We have an MA in progress on this. Yes. Let me think. If our measure of yeah, I mean, if we measure, say, the change in non-white population, even if they had one non-white in Lake Wobegon 20 years ago, and they have 3 now, that would be a 300% increase. So, in that sense, it would still get a score, and we could analyze the increase, and if the late night series of The Detective and others have a little bit of NPR appeal with saying, hey, this is an interesting place. I'd like to move to Lake Wobegon. Maybe that, in fact, is working. Maybe tolerance is attracting those two other non-whites. So I think I think Lake Wobegon ought to be able to be fitted to this map in ways that don't necessarily contradict it. But even though it illustrates your point that some places have very low non-white, the whole Northwest is the same way. Seattle, Portland, Oregon, and so forth. They're the same kind of thing. Yeah. Take Seattle. I mean, Lake Wobegon is a little bit fanciful, but if we take Seattle elected an African-American mayor. Okay, and this is something I've worked on a lot. I mean, why are African-American mayors elected? All right, and I'm suggesting that the dynamic of election of Harold Washington, Chicago, is drastically different from Seattle. In Chicago, roughly 80% of African Americans voted for Harold Washington. Most whites voted against Harold Washington. It was a classic black versus white kind of racial confrontation. In Seattle, you had 5-7% African American, something like that. But what that says is that 90% of whites in Seattle, or a large proportion of whites, were willing to say, yes, let's have an African-American mayor. And maybe the Portland Oregons and the Lake Wobegons are more like Seattle in the sense that there may be minimal racism, and in fact an effort not to show that we are not racist by voting for an African-American mayor in a way that makes a general political statement. Now, you can say, would that change if the population increased? Maybe so, but that's a different issue. Is that a reasonable answer? Okay. Yes. Yeah. This is not meant to be. I added this morning. I'll be frank. I said I want to show you something which just shows the methodology, but this is not to be taken literally in detail. I just want to sort of show you that these are the coefficients of how important a particular variable is. But I'm not even sure what it is, frankly. Okay. It was early this morning. Okay. Yes. I sit on the advisory committee on economic development of CMAP, and I've argued with them they should pay more attention to amenities, and they say, oh, what for? So there are a lot of traditional people around the city who don't pay attention to that. On the other hand, Mayor Daley had a little battle with the governor and the federal government, who was saying, we want to have an airport out in the middle of downtown Chicago. And so after midnight one night, the mayor sent in some bulldozers and they put X's across the runways. And that was the classic. And so what is it now? A nature park. So we have more parks in Chicago, in part because of mayoral initiative and the bulldozers, in ways and the mayor is proud of having planted more than 1 million trees. So that is, it's not just parks, it's greenery, it's sensitivity to that kind of aesthetic, which is a drastic change in this city. This city, when I first came to Chicago, we used to turn our windshield wipers every morning because there was so much soot that had deposited from the steel mills to the south the night before. Yeah. I guess I just caution, and you have to be careful, that is, it may be that the decisions about things like green spaces in part are related to the Burnham Plan in the late 19th century of reserving, for instance, that whole area up the lakefront with the bicycle paths and so forth, which is the #1 amenity of Chicago. And in fact, the most, and has the, if you take Navy Pier and I think the aquarium areas, these are the most visited parks in the United States, 7 times the Grand Canyon. So we got massive amount, this is a massive attraction, and it's in part the Burnham Plan, which has reserved a massive amount of space, plus some of the old boulevards, which go back to 19th century decisions. Now, many of these got run down, the parks were not used, they were filled with crime, it was very difficult in, let's say, 50s, 60s, 70s. In the last 20 years, this has been transformed again, and so the parks have become very active, very participatory. There are many more programs, lots of kids are going there. So they are used and they have become a vigorous part of the city, but I guess I'm just saying we need to capture the park as the scene aspects of the park and not just measure it in terms of square space, or square footage or something. Yes?
That number is an amazing statistic, 7 times more than Grand Canyon. Does that take into account the fact that people who go to the Grand Canyon might just go once, whereas people in Chicago might visit Navy Pier multiple times?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, no, this I think includes Sally, who decided she'd come back to Chicago and she'd go to Navy Pier every Friday night to get a veggie burger. So, and probably there are fewer high-end Japanese who want to get the grandeur of the Grand Canyon. They might not get on an airplane in Tokyo just to go to Navy Pier.